All right, I knew I was going to forget to hit record. So at the state level, I want to kind of talk to you about how the state's budget works and then how that applies to local school districts. And so some of this may be redundant for some of you, but I think it's just a good reminder. So remember that the state's budget is built on a 2-year budget cycle. It's a biennium budget, which is different than a school district's budget because school districts do a budget 1 year at a time. We're about to end the first year of that biennium, and July 1st we'll start the second year. And that's important to remember in the context of what we're talking about in terms of challenges moving forward. The state school fund, oftentimes referred to as the SSF, is the portion of the state's overall budget that goes to K-12 education. Okay, so that's the state school fund, and that's important for you to understand kind of that terminology and vocabulary. So for the 2019-2021 biennium, we were allocated $9 billion for the state school fund, okay? That's the highest allocation ever in the history of K-12 education in Oregon. And all but 2 years of the last 30 years, they split that money not equally over the 2 years. They put 49% of those funds in the first year and 51% in the second year. And you know, hopefully that's for obvious reasons because your costs increase from year to year. And so that kind of helps offset those increased costs year over year. There were 2 years in my time, I was a superintendent in the same district for 20 years. And there were 2 years in my 20 years where they didn't split it 49-51. They split it 50-50. And if you weren't savvy enough to kind of correct for that internally, what that meant is likely you were going to have to make cuts in the second year because your costs go up and you only had the same state school fund amount of money for both of those years. What's going on right now at the state level is the governor has asked all state agencies to cut their budgets by 8.5%, okay? Now, the problem with that is that, remember, it's a 2-year budget, and she's asking them to cut 8.5% of what they were allocated for the 2 years. But guess what? We've already spent almost all of our money in the first year. So what that means is it really is more like a 17% reduction because we only have from now until the end of next June money available, okay? Next Wednesday is a crucial day. It's when the next economic forecast comes out for the state. And what we're assuming is that the general fund for the state of Oregon is going to be down $3 billion from the amount that was used to allocate funds for the 2019-2021 biennium. Now, with using cash reserves that are available, we think that $3 billion will be taken down to about $1.8 billion. That's our hope. But again, cutting $1.8 billion between now and the end of next June is a very, very difficult task. There are 2 funds available that I want you all to be aware of. The legislature has the authority to tap into these funds. And so the governor's across the board cuts, that's what she has the authority to do. She has to do it evenly across all state agencies. That's just the beginning of this process. After she does that, then from there, a lot of politics come into play. A lot of advocacy efforts come into play. The legislature gets to grapple with those proposed reductions, and they can change all of that. They can say, no, we're going to completely eliminate this state agency and not cut anything from these agencies. That's not likely to happen. But this is just the first step in this conversation. So I want you to know that doesn't mean this is a done deal. Those 2 pots of money that are available for K-12 education include what's called the Education Stability Fund and the Rainy Day Fund. And About 2 months ago, we thought there was close to $3 billion between those two funds. But because what's happened to the economy over that period of time, we think now it's more likely to be about 1.5 billion. Now, certainly they could grab that money and say, let's spend it all, and we could stay whole for next year. That's not likely to happen. I mean, that would be like all of us taking our savings account and, using our entire savings account to purchase something. That savings account is then gone, and then we have to be able to maintain with our operating costs on just what's in the general fund. Okay. Whoops. Again, the state school fund appropriation was $9 billion. And I want to break down that $9 billion for you, because not all of those dollars come from the state's general fund. Okay. As you can see on the slide, 7.7 billion of the 9 billion comes from the state's general fund. Okay. And as you've been reading and learning, and maybe you knew this before, but we only have a two-legged stool in Oregon for funding: income taxes and property taxes, basically. I mean, those are the two big sources of funding. When you have a two-legged stool, it can be very unsteady when the economy's not going well, okay? A lot of states have a third leg to that stool, a third significant leg to that stool, and that's usually something like a sales tax, right? And then it's steadier and can withstand kind of turbulent times in terms of downturns in the economy. Okay, so the 7.7 billion of the 9 billion comes from the state's general fund. The rest of those dollars, 1.3 billion, come from some small pots of revenue that we get in this state. You can see on the screen, lottery, we get 535 million of the 9 billion from the lottery proceeds. The marijuana tax, 103 million. The corporate activity tax, which is brand new, that's tied to the Student Success Act, and I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail in a minute. That's a funding source we didn't have prior to the passage of that House bill. But the point here is that to get to the 9 billion, they were counting on, the state was counting on 643 million of the Student Success Act dollars to get to the $9 billion, okay? And there are some other little pots of money that gives about the remaining 5 million of the 9 billion, okay? The other funds, that 1.3 billion, the 8.5% across the board cuts, that doesn't apply to those funds. We don't know yet, we have some pretty good guesses, but we don't know yet the impact on those funds. But we're likely to see a significant decrease in those funds that make up the 1.3 billion, especially like with lottery proceeds, because, restaurants and bars have been closed down. We're seeing just a significant decrease in the revenue generated from lottery. Now, we hear the marijuana tax, that's not the case. It's actually may increase a little bit, but you can see it's such a small amount of money that it doesn't have a super big impact on the state school fund appropriation, okay? All right, I'm gonna go ahead and move us forward. I want to talk a little more detail about the Student Success Act. That is a result of House Bill 3427 being passed in the Oregon legislature. It's not a one and done kind of bill like we've had in prior years in Oregon. It's a bill that goes on biennium after biennium, and it is expected to generate $2 billion each biennium, okay? And actually that will grow a little bit every 2 years as well, theoretically, unless you have things like a global pandemic happen, right? The funds are generated from a modest corporate activity tax. I mean, the passage of this act was absolutely historic in Oregon. Like I said, I've been in K-12 education for 36 years, 20 years as a superintendent. We've never seen anything like this. At COSA, we were very prepared for this to be referred to the voters in Oregon and have to try to withstand a referral process that could have repealed this bill. We were all geared up for that, and in the end, the opponents backed off and decided not to challenge it, which was really awesome. You all know we've been on a high putting together our student investment account plans, which is the plans that districts have to submit in order to spend their Student Success Act dollars. That was a lot of work to get those done, but that coupled with the $9 billion state school fund allocation was going to put us at a position in Oregon where we were going to achieve almost the Oregon Quality Education Model funding, which we never thought we'd get to in Oregon. So to go from that high to now being talk about the kinds of reductions we're faced for next year is just a major whiplash and is very, very hard to take, okay? So I want to break down that $9 billion just a little bit for you and remind you that 50% of those funds go to K-12 education, and that's to fund the student investment account applications that come in for each district, okay? 30% of the funds are dedicated to statewide initiatives. Those are things like the big chunks are Ballot Measure 98, also called the High School Success Act. It funds a big portion of that initiative, expanded nutrition programs to be able to feed more kids. Those are the two big kind of pots of money in that statewide initiative pot. And then the remaining 20% was dedicated to early learning initiatives, whether it be Preschool Promise or other early learning initiatives, okay? Those plans were due April 15th. You know, right now it's really up in the air about what level of funding we will actually see from the Student Success Act. Our position at COSA and administrators across the state help us generate those positions is that we have to fully fund the state school fund, the $9 billion first. And that means if we have to use whatever we get from the Student Success Act to do that, that's what we're going to advocate for. Once we get to $9 billion in the state school fund, if we can even get there, then whatever is left would be what would be available to contribute to the Student Success Act. So there's still a lot of unknowns and a lot of discussion coming forward as well. But you may be in a district, and there are many districts who began to hire for and spend their money that they expected to get from the Student Success Act, and now are really challenged with what they're going to have to do moving forward. In some cases, lay off people that they've hired, in some case not hire people, you know, and everywhere in between. So I see Jennifer has her hand up. Go ahead, Jennifer. Unmic yourself.
Yeah, I'm just curious. You said that COSA's position is to fully fund the state school fund first, and then if there's money left over, put that to the Student Success Act. So how does that work logistically? Can the governor just say, oh, that money that we were going to bring in for the Student Success Act is going to roll to the general fund?
Yep. It doesn't actually roll to the general fund, but the money from the Student Success Act is allocated to the state school fund. And yes, the way the bill was written, the legislature and the governor has the authority to do that. So good question. Yeah. Okay, so I want to kind of take that state level picture, and then I want to bring it down to a district level. You guys are in the professional licensure program, which is about that district level administration and leadership. So at the district level, I just want to review the budget process and how that works. So step number one in a district's budget process is that the superintendent proposes a budget. Very similar to what Governor Brown does. You know, she's asked for these 8.5% across all agencies cuts. And then all those numbers she takes and proposes a budget to the legislature. Very similar to what happens in a district. The superintendent has their process about how they gather input from, you know, their constituencies, community and staff, their leadership teams and all of that. And then the superintendent proposes a budget to the budget committee. Some districts are have already done that. It usually happens about the first few weeks in May. Some are just getting ready to do it. Some have postponed it a little bit to see what they're dealing with based on next week's economic forecast. Okay. That proposed budget goes to the budget committee. The budget committee is made up of your school board members, and school boards range in size from Oregon from 5 to 9. So some districts have 5 school board members, some have 7, and there are 2 districts that still have 9 school board members, okay? Then what the school board does is they appoint an equal number of community members to round out the budget committee. So if you're in a district that has 7 school board members, you appoint 7 community members, and your budget committee is now made up of 14 members, okay? In the district that I served in, we had 14 people on our budget committee, okay? The budget committee's job is to hear the proposed budget, and then when they're ready, approve a budget. And approve and adopt sometimes get confused, so I want you to understand the difference. The budget committee's role is to approve a budget, okay? They can do whatever they want to that proposed budget. You know, they can change it, they can accept it, they can take several meetings to do this, they can do it in one meeting. It just kind of depends on what's going on in your particular school district, okay? Once the budget committee approves the budget, then that approved budget goes back to the school board. And remember, those school board members are a part of the budget committee, so it's kind of an interesting process. It goes back to the school board for final adoption, okay? A district's budget has to be adopted by June 30th each year, but practically that means that it has to be adopted by about the 3rd week in June, because there's all kinds of paperwork that has to be filled out with your adopted budget information that has to be filed, and all that has to be done by June 30th, okay? So this is what a state school fund estimate looks like for a school district. And I sent you those links. Was anybody able to get onto the Oregon Department of Ed and get their state school fund estimate? Oh, great. Jennifer just held hers up. Jason gave me a thumbs up. Let me know if you have any trouble with that. So school finance honestly wasn't like my passion or thing when I was a superintendent. I mean, I really thought of myself as an instructional leader, but I had to become kind of an expert in school funding. And so I really learned how to geek out on this stuff. And I had, 20 years of state school fund estimates. And in one year, you might get 8 to 10 different estimates for that particular year. And so I had, a compilation of those things, and I can go back and analyze from year to year and look at trends. This is what a state school fund estimate looks like. And I'm going to walk you through each of these boxes and have you understand basically what those things mean, and then be able to interpret what yours means for your school district. So on the next several slides, I've broken these boxes down, but I just wanted you to see the state school fund estimate as a whole. Okay, so everything in Oregon's state school fund estimate system is based on the number of students you have in your district and the unique characteristics of those students. And these unique characteristics get additional weighting, okay? So you can see here at the very top, the first row in green, it says ADMR. That means average daily membership resident. That means the actual number of kid bodies you have in your school district, okay? And you can see on this estimate, this district has 2,689 students, okay? They're just weighted as 1 student, okay, for each kid. Then we get into these white rows, and on the white rows, these are the unique characteristics that get additional weighting in the funding formula, okay? So the first one is second language students. You get an additional half weighting. So if you have a student that English is their second language, you get 1.5 weights for those students, okay? You can see in this district, they have 115 second language students. And so, whoops, lost you guys there. That generates 57.5 additional weights in their funding formula. Okay. Next row, students on IEPs. Okay. But this is a caveat that you need to know about. That's capped at 11% of your average daily membership. Okay. So in this district, they have 2,689 students. You can see on that row, I put 505. They actually have 505 students on an IEP, but because they're capped at 11%, they only get credit for 295.79 students, okay? The third white row is students above that 11%. And this is just the formula. They take a pot of money and they say for every district that has more kids beyond that 11% cap, we're going to take that number of kids, divide it into that pot of money, and we're going to give you some additional weighting. So you can see for this district, they got an additional 62.1 students. And so what is that? That's like 350 students that they got the additional weighting for. But remember, they have 505 students on IEPs. So there's still a pretty significant gap between the additional weighting and what they really have, okay? Next row, students in parenting, pregnant and parenting programs. You have to have a program. It's not just that you have kids that, have kids or are pregnant and parenting. You actually have to have a program for them. It can be the mother or the father, either one. And you can see in this particular district, they have 2 students that fit that category. That's an additional full weighting for students that are pregnant or parenting. Students in poverty, you get an additional quarter weighting. And this isn't, in this particular district, they got credit for 558.73 students in poverty. They have way more students than that are actually living in poverty. This is just a number that's given, and it's based on a statewide formula. They have a pot of money. They divide it out among the districts, and they tell you what your allocation is. So it's not really matched to actually how many kids you have in poverty. Same way with the foster care or neglected and delinquent students. That's an additional quarter weighting. Remote small school correction is for districts that have small schools that are remote, and the formula is based on the distance that these remote schools are from their next closest district, and then they also have to fit the small category, which is under a certain size. In this particular district, they have 2 remote schools, and those schools generate an additional 72 students waiting. And this happens to be my former district that I'm showing you, so I know these details pretty well. These 2 schools over the years, because of this additional remote school correction weighting, it made it very difficult to talk about having those be up for consideration to be closed when we had to go through the process of closing schools, because 72 students or 72 weights times 8,000 per student generates quite a bit of money for those 2 small schools. And if you were to close one of those schools, then you lose that funding. Some districts get what's called small high school correction. And that was a piece of legislation, and your small high school had to have existed prior to the date of the passage of this legislation. And so a lot of districts have small high schools now, but they don't qualify for this small high school correction because it doesn't fit the way the legislation was passed. So all those additional weights, if you look in that far right column, at the very top, we started out with actually 2,689 students. But when you add all those additional weights in there, we're now down to up to 3,325.84 students, okay? So now here's a little caveat to the extended ADMW. So ADMW is average daily membership weighted. So remember, ADMR was the actual number of kids. ADMW includes those weights. And so the way the funding formula works in Oregon, and this was to protect school districts that were in kind of constant declining enrollment, because you can see when your enrollment goes down, your funding goes down, right? And so to kind of smooth that path a little bit, they allow districts to use their current year's ADMW or the prior year's ADMW, whichever is greater, okay? So you can see on this slide the scenario that says in 2019-20, in the current year, they have 3,369 ADMW. Next year, their projections are that's going to go down, you know, by what, 45 students, to 3,325.84. But they get to use the prior year's enrollment because it's greater, okay? And that helps that district not have to kind of jump off the cliff of decreased funding so quickly. They have more time to plan for it. Okay, here's another little hinky thing in the state school fund formula. And this is called the teacher experience adjustment. And how this works is the state calculates the average teacher experience for teachers across the state. And you can see for next year, they've calculated that to be 12.1 years. Then they calculate your teacher experience in your district. And you can see in this district, the average is 12.64. And then they make an adjustment in your state school fund allocation based on whether your experience is higher than the state average or lower than the state average, okay? And I think you could see why that would be. More experienced teachers cost districts more. They're, you know, further along on the salary schedule. And so this is a way to acknowledge that for districts. And the impact can be pretty big in a smaller district. Again, this is my former district. We had years where our experience in our district was, you know, 3.5 years above the state average. In those kind of years, it was a pretty significant bump in our state school fund allocation. This isn't huge. So this shows that they're 0.54 higher than the state average. And what you do with that difference is you multiply it times 25 bucks per ADMW. So it's 0.54 times the $25 times your ADMW. Okay, and remember the ADMW for this district is about 3,369. So it's about $13.50. It is $13.50 more per ADMW for this district next year. I see Jennifer has her hand up. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Sorry, but I'm curious about that. Is that the actual experience of the teacher or the experience of the teacher in that district?
It is actually the experience of that teacher. Good question. Jason.
What about experience of that teacher in state or does out of state? So you get that transfer.
State.
State.
Yeah.
Okay, I figured that's the one place to track them, really.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So now we're looking at the box. Let me see if I can go back here real quick. Now we're looking at the box in the upper left corner of the state school fund estimate. It's called local revenue. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my slide where I'm breaking that down for you. Okay, so in Oregon's system, like I said, you get your income sources from two main pots of money, property taxes and income tax, okay? And this was during my time early on in my career as a superintendent. Oregon changed their funding formula to get to equity across districts because you had districts that were property rich, Pleasant Hill School District, Lake Oswego School District. And because Seaside, because you had high value properties and lots of them, you were generating more money from your school district. And we had this grossly inequitable system where a kid in Pleasant Hill, they might be getting $11,000 per kid. And a kid in Cottage Grove, Oregon, they might be getting $7,000 a kid. And that created a really inequitable system. So they built the formula in a way that leveled that out. So the amount you get per kid is pretty consistent across districts. And I say pretty consistent because there are a few things that still make for inequities. On local revenue, this is basically property taxes. You'll see there are a couple other things that they count in local revenue. So try to just follow me on the local revenue, and then I'll show you how that fits together in the big picture of the formula. So you can see, you know, property taxes is the largest source of local revenue. Federal forest fees, some years we get it, some years we don't. It's kind of weird that they call it local, you know, because it's money from the feds, but it is based on forest in your area. And this was a piece of legislation at the federal level that was never intended to go on indefinitely. It had a sunset date, but there's been a lot of lobbying every year that the sunset date came up, and they have been able to wrangle it back in there from year to year. In my former district, we used to get about $600,000 a year in federal forest fees, and you can see the projection next year for this district at 109. So the money has gone way down, but at least there's a little bit still in there. Common School Fund and County School Fund. Long story about both of these funds. These were funds that were generated years ago. Money goes in based on state lands, and then it gets distributed out to school districts in the formula. You don't have to figure out those numbers. Those numbers are given to you and plugged into your budget, okay? Some districts have state managed timber. Obviously in South Lane School District, they don't. There's a category called in lieu of property taxes, and sometimes you have revenue adjustments. All of those items make up what's called local revenue. And you can see for this district, a little over $8 million is generated in local revenue. So kind of remember that 8 million local revenue. And when we put the whole formula together, you'll see where that comes back into play. Okay, here's what the formula looks like. And if you hate numbers, just hang in there because it's way simpler than it looks. It really is. So let's just focus on this top line. So remember, extended ADMW is your kids with those unique characteristics added in there, right? Then that gets multiplied by a bunch of things, okay? $4,500 per ADMW is the starting point. When they developed this formula years ago, that's where the starting point was at, okay? Then you have to also add in that teacher experience adjustment. So remember the $25 times the up or down compared to the state average gets put in there too, okay? Then you have what's called a funding ratio, okay? So on the second line, I tried to plug in the numbers from the district example that I used. So if you can follow along, remember 3,369 was the extended ADMW. That gave us the special ed kids, the second language kids, the pregnant and parenting kids, all those factors, okay? Then it's $4,500 plus some factors. Remember, $25 times 0.54 was the $13.50 more per ADMW that this district gets because their teachers on average are more experienced than the state average. Then look at this absolutely crazy number that goes out for a lot of decimal places. 1.921058951999. This is a little bit harder actually to explain, but I tracked this funding ratio for the 20 years that I was superintendent. And I tracked it within a year and then over the years. And when I first started out as a superintendent, this funding ratio was like 1.2 something in a bunch of numbers. And so you can see over the years how the ratio has increased. And the ratio is really only a factor of two things. How big the state school fund allocation is, the $9 billion, and how many kids weighted we have in the state. And that forms what the funding ratio is going to be. So if you do the math here and go across, what this shows you is this district in the general purpose grant from the state school fund is entitled to $29,211,000 and some change, right? See that? Okay, now I'm going to throw in one additional factor. Now we're going to move down to the bottom of this slide, which is called the total formula revenue. The only difference between this calculation and the one that we just talked about is this adds in the transportation grant from the state, okay? And just a little brief explanation of the transportation grant. Your districts get reimbursed 70%, 80%, or 90% of your eligible transportation expenses, okay? And the reason I say eligible is there are things that you cannot get reimbursed for transportation. The biggest one being athletics. They don't allow you to be reimbursed for athletics, which I could get on my soapbox about that, but I won't. In the district that I was in, we got 70% reimbursement. So what I spent in the prior year, 70% of those expenses then got added to my state school fund allocation the following year. So it's always a year in arrears, okay? So you can see here that 70% was $1,869,000. When you got that added to your general purpose grant, that shows for next year, this district is entitled to $31,080,000 and some change, okay? Okay, if you're stressed out and you're on number overload, just take a deep breath. We're almost to the end and you're going to go, wow, that's not that bad. Okay. All right, I'm going to the next slide. So that 31 million that this district has coming to them in the state school fund formula, the first thing that happens is the revenue that's going to be generated for this district under that local revenue category gets subtracted, because that local revenue comes to your district directly. It's property taxes mostly, remember, okay? So they take away what you're going to get in local revenue, and then what remains, this 23,005,000 and some change, is what the state has to pay you on for that school year. Okay. Now I want to show you how this works, because it's a teeter-totter. If this district were to generate more local revenue beyond what they estimated, because this is based on an estimate, let's say they brought in 9 million rather than 8 million, then they get $1 million less on the state school fund portion. So that's how you provide equity from district to district that are property poor and property rich. They're entitled to the 31 million or whatever the formula says they're entitled to, and then you back out the local revenue. And if that's high, then the portion that the state contributes isn't very much. If the local revenue is low, then the state is going to contribute at a much higher percentage in that particular district, okay? Then what you see at the bottom of this slide, they do a little calculation which gives you the amount per ADMW that you're getting, okay? And remember, the general purpose grant, which is the first line there, does not include the transportation grant. So without the transportation grant, this district is getting $8,671 per weighted kid. So if that's a kid on an IEP, well, let's don't use that example because that's capped. If that's a kid that's pregnant or parenting, then that district is actually going to get what, 17,300 and some dollars for that kid, right? Okay. The second line, the total formula revenue, the only difference is that adds in that transportation reimbursement. That makes it 9,225 a kid. And then they also put the charter school rate in here because a lot of districts sponsor charter schools, and that's the rate that's used for their charter schools. And that's always on the state school fund estimate as well. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Sorry, I just want to understand. So this rate that is listed for charter schools basically would not include the transportation, because most charters don't do transportation, correct?
Right.
And then we take this rate that's given to charter schools and we multiply that by our, like, whatever your contract is, right? So we get 85% for K through 8th grade and 95% for 9 through 12. So though that's our starting number, we still multiply that.
Right. That's a great observation, Jennifer. Yes. And remember, by law, it's 95% of that has to go to the charter school for elementary, and 80% has to go to the charter school for secondary students. But again, your contract might have negotiated something higher than that. And you're absolutely right. You multiply that, and that's how you come up with that rate. Okay. This is going to be just, I don't want you to like get too, oh, go ahead, Jennifer. Did you have another question?
I'm sorry.
That's
I
all right.
just
Don't be
want
sorry.
to, so then when we separate out, because we have to separate those kids out, K8 and 9-12, the weights stay with those kids, correct?
Yes.
So if you're a high schooler and you're a pregnant teen, then that weight goes on the formula with that percentage. But if you're in poverty and you're elementary, that weight goes there, correct?
Right. Except I'll go back to the pregnant and parenting example. That charter school would have to have an approved pregnant and parenting program. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Which would be, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, this page that you're looking at right now is actually the first page of the district's budget that we've been talking about. And this is the revenue page. So remember, revenue is the money coming in, and expenditures are the money going out. So this represents the first page of the budget. And this doesn't correspond number-wise, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things. These are all the sources of revenue that a district has coming in. The parts that we've been talking about mostly, that upper box that starts with taxes, prior year's taxes, payment in lieu of property taxes, that's basically a lot of your local revenue. Although if you move down a little on the page, 100-2101 County School Fund, remember that comes off the local revenue page. But what I wanted to show you is 100-3101 State School Fund General Support, and you go out to the far right and you can see the State School Fund is the largest source of revenue for the district's general fund budget. And that would be typical in almost all 197 of our school districts. The other thing that I wanted you to notice is down towards the bottom, 100-5400 beginning fund balance. This is basically, it's called different things. At the end of the year, you call it ending fund balance. At the beginning of the year, you call it beginning fund balance. Some people call it reserves. Some people call it savings. It's basically the money that you have at the end of one year that then moves into the next year, okay? And ending fund balances, cash reserves, are always a big source of conversation and sometimes conflict, okay? Because a district needs to carry in an appropriate amount of ending fund balance. And ending fund balance is typically for unforeseen, you don't know these things are going to happen, catastrophic kinds of circumstances, okay? In my former district, that would have been Bohemia Elementary School's HVAC system blowing up. And at any moment it could have, and had that happened, to replace that, it would have been, you know, somewhere around $1.4 million, okay? The way I managed ending fund balance for my district, I'll tell you, and it's not the same that everybody manages it, but what we said in my district was we needed to have $1 million on hand for those unforeseen catastrophic kind of things. Our budget, you know, during my time was around somewhere between $25 and $30 million a year for the general fund budget. We said we needed $1 million in reserves for those unforeseen catastrophic kinds of situations. Anything above $1 million, we put back into the budget and plan to spend. So you can see if you go out to the far right, bottom corner there, beginning fund balance, In this particular year, it showed that we were estimating we were going to have $2.4 million in beginning fund balance. Then when you went to the expenditure pages in the budget, you would see a line that said contingency, which is the word for, you know, these unforeseen catastrophic kinds of things, and you'd see $1 million. But the other 1.4 million of that was spread out somewhere throughout the budget and was planned to be spent. Okay. Now, what's an appropriate amount of ending fund balance? Depends on what chair you sit in. When I sat in the superintendent's chair, I would have been really happy if I could have, you know, more like 7 to 10%. In Oregon, because budgets have been tight for so many years, it's pretty common for your ending fund balance or your reserves to be around the 3 to 5% range. And there are some years when they've gotten a whole lot lower than that. And that's, you know, you're living on thin ice because something happens and you're in trouble, okay? But I just wanted you to begin to understand that concept of beginning fund balance. You can see on this particular slide too, if you look at the 3 years prior, you know, I had a beginning fund balance of $3.1 million. And then what the conversation is, okay, that's a little bigger than it should be. Why were we so far off that year? You know, why did we have this excess money? And we looked and analyzed and made sure that, you know, it wasn't quite that high again. Okay, the final thing, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. When you open a district budget, every item, every line item begins with a string of numbers, okay? And I want to just briefly explain that string of numbers, because if you know this stuff, you can look at any line item in a budget and have kind of a good idea of what that line item is projected to be spent on, okay? So here's the series of numbers on this slide. The first set of numbers, 3 digits, is the funded number, okay? And you'll see numbers from 100 typically to 700. Fund 100 is the general fund budget. That's where the state school fund, the local property taxes, local revenue, that is the general fund budget. Those are the dollars that a district has to operate in a given year, okay? You have other funds, and I'm not going to go into a lot of those details, but like Fund 200 would be where you'd put grants, where you'd put title allocations from the federal government. You know, you get some, let's say, big CTE initiative grant. Those are the kinds of things you'd see in Fund 200, okay? Fund 400 is where all your capital construction stuff goes. So if you had a bond, that's where you'd see your bond in Fund 400. And it's just important for people to understand that, because Fund 100 is the operations of the district. The 200s through the 700s really vary from year to year, come with a lot of different stipulations about how those monies can be spent, okay? The second set of numbers, which is a 4-digit set of numbers, is called function. And the function tells you more detail about that expenditure. And I'm going to show you a page in a minute of the range of function numbers that you might see. You know, anything in the 1000 series is about instruction with kids. Anything in the 2000 series is about support services, okay? And then within the thousands and the 2000s, you have a bunch of other detailed numbers, okay? The third set of numbers, 3 digits, is called the object code. Really common object codes would be 310. 310 would be anything to do with professional technical services. You have a contract with somebody. Anything in the 400s is going to be materials and supplies, textbooks, okay? Anything in the 100s are going to be salaries. Like 111, because I know these codes, that means we're talking about an elementary teacher, okay? It's that elementary teacher's salary. Anything in the 200s on the object codes are going to be associated payroll costs, insurance, PERS, those kinds of things, okay? The fourth set of numbers is the location. It's 3 digits. Each one of your schools in your district office has a location number. So like if I saw this location number 640, I knew that expenditure was at Cottage Grove High School. Okay, it's associated and tied to a school. Area of responsibility is super complicated. It's something they did only about 10 years ago. And it gets down to the detail of the content area. And it's really a pain in the butt because if you buy paper for your high school, you have to break it down and say how much of that expenditure was for the science department and the language arts department. And it drives me crazy. And as a superintendent, I never really had to deal with it because my CFO did that. And I just tried to ignore it as best I could. But I want you to be aware of it. Okay, so I always had this little cheat sheet for my administrators, and they had a little laminated sheet. They had this, and then another slide I'll show you in a minute, just to remind them. I had it for my budget committee members, because budget committee members turn over like school board members turn over. So like every year, you're pretty much having to reteach this. And I always had these little cards out in front of them. So as we were going through the proposed budget, you know, I'd give them a little challenge. I'd say, okay, on page 7, the third expenditure on there, what do you think that's for? And then they'd go through their system of trying to detect what, you know, that expenditure related to. So again, these are the fund numbers, first 3 numbers in that string of numbers, the first set of numbers. And remember, 100's a general fund, 200's called special revenue fund. That's grant, project, stuff like that. 300's is like obligations related to bonds for your district. 400's paying back, you know, the money that you've spent for bonds. 400's is the actual capital expenses. You know, you build a new school, that's where you're spending that money out of. And then 700's are trust and agency funds. Those can be like a trust fund that somebody has established with your district to provide scholarships based on the interest from those funds. That would be a 700 fund. Okay, so again, that's the first set of numbers, 3 digits. Those are the range of fund numbers that you'll see. Here's a list of the function numbers. And again, you can see at the top, I said that's the second set of numbers. It's 4 digits. And again, this helps you get more detailed about what that expenditure is for. Everything in the thousands is instruction. Everything in the 2000s is support services. And then you can see how it goes down through 7,000. And typically in a general fund budget, you'll mostly just see 1,000s and 2,000s. You don't see a lot of the 3,000 through 7,000 function numbers. These are some of the object codes. There's a lot more object codes available than this, but these are the big ones. So again, this is the third set of numbers, 3 digits. Remember, I told you when you see anything in the 100s, that's salaries. And then you can see how it breaks down even further. So if it's 111, it's licensed. If it's 112, it's classified. If it's 113, it's administrative. Okay. 200s are associated payroll costs. Remember, I talked to you about 400s are supplies and materials, and so on. And then this is just a location and area of responsibility, so you can see the schools, and every school had a location number. And then the last thing, and I promise I'm going to stop, this is how I tracked what my ending fund balance would look like in any given year. I know it looks super complicated, and it's really not. It's just this Excel spreadsheet that I created. And basically the top part of this spreadsheet is the revenue side of things. And then the bottom part, about the last 4 or 5 rows, are expenditures. And the thick black line that you see going up and down at right after December, that line moves each month. And what's on the left side of that black line, then we actually go in and put the actual numbers in there. And what's on the right side of the line are the projected numbers. And so you can see at the very beginning of the year, the black line would be over here right after the second column, right after the budget line. And those budget numbers are just the budgeted numbers, and then we spread them out over the year. And then, like I said, as we get through a month, then we go back in and put the actuals. And then what this does for me is at the very far right, it tells me how much we're over or under on the revenue side and or the expenditure side. And then these little calculations down at the bottom just show you that based on where we're at today, the district was looking to have $1.771 million in our ending fund balance projection. Okay. And what I wanted to point out is look at the property tax line. So it's the first line under revenues up there at the top. You have to be able to project when your property taxes are going to come in for a district. So you can see that typically your biggest chunk comes in November, but that can vary a little bit from year to year. And what I would expect in this upcoming year, you're going to see a lot less than you normally would in November because people aren't able to pay their property taxes because they've been laid off, right? And so I think we're going to see a real problem with how property taxes come in this next year. And that will create a little cash flow problem in some cases for districts. Okay, done. I'm going to open it up for questions. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Sorry, I'm always that kid.
Don't be
So
sorry. This is good.
if that property tax comes in low, then what's subtracted from the state's general fund is less as well. So then that makes the state's responsibility more?
Right, exactly. And so what's the problem with that? When the state has a finite pot of money, right?
We don't
then
have those funds either.
Sometimes you're going to have a gap, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. They do a pretty good job of, you know, building in some cushion. You know, you're being paid. Oh, this is another thing I forgot to tell you, but you're being paid on your projections about your ADMW for the upcoming year. That gets corrected a year later. So let's just say, for example, we predicted we were going to have 3,400 ADMW and we only had 3,200. We're going to get paid the whole year on 3,400, but the following May, they're going to take that out of our payment because we were overpaid for the year. So as a superintendent, you're typically working in 3-year budgets at one time. You're working in the current year, you're working in the prior year, and you're projecting for the next year. And you got to just get really comfortable with kind of that weirdness about the formula. Okay, I really wanted to quit sharing my screen. There we go. Figure out how to get back there. Okay. All right, fire away. Jason, you had your hand up.
So when you're looking at a district whose funding is almost all local revenue, or is all local revenue, because we don't get any state funding.
Right, you're one of the very unique ones.
Yeah, well, us and Jewel and Neocani once in a while,
Mm-hmm.
I think. So if we drop below with our local funding revenue, the state's supposed to say we're going to get a certain percentage, but if the state's going to cut everybody across the board, so that ADMW number that everybody has is going to drop by a percentage anyway. So we're never going to catch, unless they're just nobody pays their property taxes, to where that. So we'll still feel a cut, but it's not a cut because of state revenue not being sent out. It's a cut because property taxes haven't been paid yet, which ultimately have to be paid. So trying to figure out when that's ultimately going to come in is the key there.
I mean, the big thing for you, Jason, is that you have to go back to the total formula revenue, that formula, and it's based on your ADMW. You're entitled to whatever that formula, you know, ends up calculating out to be. Let's say it's, you know, $25 million. Now, typically, all $25 million are going to come from your local revenue. But if you don't generate all of that from your local revenue, you're still entitled to that $25 million. It's just that the state's going to have to contribute from the state school fund to get you to that $25 million.
Which puts a huge burden on them because they weren't expecting that.
Yeah, but again, I'm going to say that, you know, on December 10th, districts submit their projected ADMW for the next year. Mm-hmm. And the state, you know, adds all those numbers together, and then they put a cushion in there. So there's, you know, there's a little, they're not going to just budget it, you know, based on those estimates. They're going to give some room. So there's typically some wiggle room. But what happens is if the estimates of ADMW for the state are under what we actually end up having, then the way they deal with that is they adjust that funding ratio number, that 1.9 and all those digits. They just bring that down to 1.8 or whatever. And then what ends up happening is you get less per kid. And again, like I said, in some years, you'll get 8 or so estimates. So far for the 2021 school year, there's been one estimate. That came out on February 25th. If you went in and downloaded your district's estimate, you'll see that at the top. But that's not the done deal by any stretch. They'll put out another one here shortly after the economic forecast comes out, and it's going to be brutal. And when you line those two up, the one you had in February and the one you're going to get here soon, it's going to be pretty hard to take, I think. We'll see. And then you'll get estimates even during the year. Like you can get to January or February, and for a variety of reasons, they'll send out a new estimate, which is an adjustment. And so those numbers fluctuate, just because they said on, June 1st or May 1st that this is what your estimate was going to look like for next year. That's not always the end result.
I had a question on the transportation. Is the 70, 80, 90%, what's that based on? I mean, how's the district get moved from 70 to 80 or so on?
Right. I'm not going to be very eloquent in telling you the exact formula, but it's based on your geographic range and reach that you have to run your buses.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's kind of crazy. I was always kind of miffed about this. And basically, they take 197 districts and they rank order you from, the most mileage for transportation to the least. And then literally, I can't remember the exact number. It's like the top 25 districts are 90%, the next 25% are 80%, and then everybody below that is 70%. And like in my district, I mean, we had kids on a bus for a really long time, really long ways, and we were still only 70%. Yeah, so you got to think about those districts over in Eastern Oregon that, they make us look like wimps when we talk about transportation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Anne, go ahead.
Oh.
Whoops, there you go.
Sorry, touchpad wasn't working. Thank you first for all this. This is very helpful. I had a question about the waiting for IEP students above the 11% cap.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, do you have to have a sort of a minimum number to get any waiting there? Because we have more than the 11% cap, but we do not receive any additional funding.
Yeah, it's a little bit similar to transportation, because what they do is they take all the districts that are above 11% and how much they're above the 11%, and then they rank order them. And then they have a pot of money dedicated to the above 11%. And then they dole it out from, the highest percent on down. So you must not be far enough above the 11% to get into that mix. It used to be like, because I was around forever as a superintendent, it used to be that you had to write a grant and make your case for the above the 11%. And it was based on the merit of your grant. And I had just an absolutely phenomenal special ed director that could write like you couldn't believe. And so we always got this huge amount above the 11%. And then when they went to the equity formula, they made it way more equitable. And they said, no, we're just going to take all the above the 11% and divide it into that pot of money. I'm surprised you don't get any. I don't know that I've ever heard that.
Well, on this, the February 1, we have 86 IEP students. We're getting credit for 62 of them and nothing on the line that's above the 11% cap.
That's really interesting to me. I'm going to ask some questions about that, Anne, and get back to you on that, because I honestly have never heard of you not getting something for above the 11%. And, the other thing that I'll just mention is that these state school fund estimates can have mistakes on them. And actually the one that I showed you for my former district has a mistake on it. they're actually using the ADMW, that 3,369, for the number going into 2021, not realizing that that 3,369 number actually came from the 2018-19 school year. Because remember, we're in 1920, you can use your current year or the prior year, which is ever was greater. Well, in this district's case, 1819 was greater. That's what they're using now. They can't use that in 2021, although the estimate has that number in there. So there can be mistakes, Ann, and so I'm going to do some asking on that, and I'll get back to you.
Thank you.
You bet. As far as I wanted to make a brief mention about your discussion board post this week, I don't really enjoy this case study very much. You know, the content of these courses, we have to negotiate with Concordia Chicago around, and these courses are also taught to students that aren't in Oregon. And so this isn't a great example for Oregon, because it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around, because states do their formulas much differently. Don't get too worried about your analysis related to this case study in terms of it being right or wrong. Just try to think through logically, like in a property rich district where they're going to now take less of your property taxes into the state school fund formula calculation versus a property poor district. Just try to look at it from those kind of bigger categories that we've talked about today. Don't worry about whether or not you pick the right district coming out ahead or behind. Just try to logically explain your thinking around your observations related to this case. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Is it accurate to say that in Oregon, since Measure 5 and 50 passed, that really the main inequities exist because of bond measures?
Great point. So, I forgot to mention this. So prior to measures 5, 47, and 50 that had all to do with limiting property tax collection for K-12 schools, 70% of local school district funding came from property taxes, and only 30% came from the state. When they put these limits on the property taxes, then that shifted the burden greatly. And now it's more like, these are rough numbers, about 30% on average comes from local property taxes and 70% comes from the state, which was a big increase in burden, right, on the state budget. So sorry, Lisa, I forgot your question.
Oh, is it accurate to say that the inequities that currently exist between districts has mostly to do with the bond measures then?
Bond measures and local option levies would be the two biggies. So a local option levy is different. You can run a local option levy to generate more funds for your general operations, and only some districts can do that. Well, only some districts can pass a local option levy. Only some districts have the capacity within the finance structure to do that. So bond measures, local option levies, and then just in general, if you think down more to the school and community involvement level, the kinds of inequities that exist because parents in Lake Oswego contribute and donate at a much higher level than maybe a smaller, less affluent school district. So those three things really contribute still to inequities, but it's much better than it used to be. And then the other thing is you have all these matching grants for when you pass a bond in your district. So like right before I retired in my former district, we had passed a bond to build a new school and a new early learning center and do all kinds of improvements throughout the district. And really the selling point for that in a community that's not an affluent community was that if we could pass that bond, we'd get a $4 million grant to add to that bond. And that's the way we've been so successful with bond measures across the past 4 years in districts that had tried for years and years and years to pass bonds and couldn't. Once this matching grant opportunity came into play, then it made it more doable for a lot of communities. Jennifer, go ahead.
So 2 questions. The first one is, you mentioned like donations and fundraisers. Is that a completely different line item on our budgets then, or does that play into our local revenue?
So it depends on what the donation is for, and it depends on the donor that gives it to you. So like schools sometimes will have donations made like for the athletic program. And it depends on your district. I mean, we were small enough and nimble enough that, like, let's say Joe Smith came in and wanted to give, you know, $1 million to the athletic program. Then they would give that to the district, and the district would put that into the athletic department budget, and then the athletic department could spend it out of there. So, you know, typically that's the way funds come in. You know, sometimes, you know, you have a different structure, like for fundraisers for, let's say for the choir program, they go out and sell candy bars. A lot of times those dollars will just be accounted for in a student body fund. And your district needs to have pretty tight guidelines about how student body funds are managed. Because if you look at mismanagement of funds over the history of schools and probably nonprofits, that's where a lot of times things go awry, because there's not a good system for that. You know, we had a pretty clear accounting for how student body funds in schools were put together, but that's not a part of the district's budget, those student body funds.
And this may be a question for another day, but I've been curious. I had a board member who kept referring to ADM as attendance and not membership. And I'm not sure, maybe I understand it correctly, but how does the attendance play into the membership?
Yeah, and that's, you know, I know we've used that for years. We say, you know, I mean, attendance is important, obviously, for learning reasons, but it doesn't have that much of a factor to play in the formula. It is average daily membership weighted, and your ADMW is calculated quarterly, and it's about the days you're in session. So your attendance is about how many days are in session, not how many kids actually attended every single day. And that's
So,
that's a
so this hype about the 92% is, so attendance is really about the number of school days, not the number of days that kids came to school.
Right. There is a little tiny factor in there that's about daily attendance, but it doesn't really have much of an impact on your funding. I mean, I don't like to really honestly share that widely because, you know, I liked people to think that it was important to come to school to learn, and because we weren't going to get money if we didn't, but it doesn't have that much of an impact. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap us up. I hope you found this useful. You know, I haven't used this structure much, but I'm really learning that, especially in this content area, this is helpful. It's hard to do some of this stuff, you know, just in the Blackboard setting and never talk face to face. So right now I'm planning to try to do something like this about every other week, especially because next week with the revenue forecast coming out, I won't do it next week, but the following week I'll come back and offer another one of these and talk in a little more detail about that. So any suggestions you want to give me, feel free to email me, or you can include it in the chat as well. I hope you have a great day, and thanks for all you're doing. I know this is just a crazy time, and, you know, personally and professionally, struggles are going on all over the place, and just hats off to you for the leadership work that you're doing and holding everything together. So have a great day, and we'll talk soon.